So I imagine we're now live. So yeah, let's start this off. Hello and welcome. Thank you to all attendees for joining, and especially to our panelists, whom I'll introduce shortly. So this will be a conversation around the historical and contemporary conditions of being both a working artist and gallerist. Just a note, there is a section for questions in the chat feature. Please feel free to submit any questions and we'll do our best, time permitting, to address these at the end of the discussion. Also a quick thank you to my colleague Megan Collins, who's running this panel as Zoom administrator, and my colleague Liz Lorenz for all of her support putting this together. My name is Nichole Caruso. I am a director at Alexander Gray Associates, a gallery in New York City and in Germantown in the Hudson Valley. And we represent the Betty Parsons estate. The idea for this discussion was actually inspired by Parsons's legacy as the sort of pioneer artist gallerist, opening her eponymous gallery in 1946 on 57th Street, almost a decade ahead of the fabled 10th Street galleries, which were almost exclusively artist run. And in many ways, a response to the more conservative 57th Street galleries. So Betty seemed to occupy a territory between conservative and avant-garde in terms of her programming, likely due to being a working artist, and we'll get to more on that soon. For now, I'll introduce our four amazing panelists who span 3 generations as well as the continental United States. Starting with Michelle Grabner. Michelle's an artist, writer, and curator, as well as founder and co-director of the Suburban in Milwaukee's Walker Point neighborhood, and the Poor Farm in rural Waupaca County, Wisconsin. She's also the Crown Professor and Senior Chair of the Painting and Drawing Department at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, where she's taught since 1996. Her work is represented by James Cohen Gallery here in New York City, the Green Gallery in Milwaukee, among others. Next is Davida Nemeroff. Davida is an artist and the founder and owner of Night Gallery in Los Angeles. The gallery has risen to prominence over the last decade, garnering acclaim as the locus for Los Angeles' thriving visual art community. She sits on the membership committee of the New Art Dealers Alliance in New York City, and co-founded Sexy Beast, which is a nonprofit that raised over $1 million for Planned Parenthood in LA between 2014 and 2018. And Eric Veit is an artist and gallerist based in New York City. He is a co-founder with Elise de Rocia of the contemporary art gallery Bodega. The gallery grew out of an artist-run exhibition space of the same name, founded in 2010 in Philadelphia, and since 2014 has been mounting exhibitions on New York's Lower East Side. And then our final panelist is Rachel Vorsanger. Rachel is the collection and research manager for the Betty Parsons Foundation and an art historian based in New York who specializes in 20th century art and visual culture. She centers her work around women and feminist histories, with the mission of bringing the legacies of women artists to the forefront of the art historical canon. And she will be sitting in today as a proxy for the late, great Betty Parsons. So, jumping off here, I've often observed that the artist-gallerist is categorized as one over the other, more often as art dealer over art maker. There's certainly a value add in my mind in terms of the insight an artist can bring to the professional realm. I think I can speak for most of my gallerist colleagues when I say that business acumen isn't necessarily at the fore with running a gallery, given how niche our operations are. It's generally a more intuitive, academic, relationship based kind of endeavor. So being an artist with a studio background isn't necessarily a disadvantage, but really an artist would have an extra sense, ostensibly, and they have the artist and community ties built in, as well as the creative drive, of course, that's essential in our industry. For Betty Parsons, I'll just quickly say that it was really her innovative, her eye for innovative talent that stemmed from her training as an artist that guided her commitment to new and emerging artists of her time. On more than one occasion, she was referred to as the den mother of abstract expressionism, being an early advocate of the great abstract expressionists, including Pollock, Rothko, Reinhardt, Still, Newman, long before they achieved notoriety. So needless to say, she had an indelible impact on the canon of 20th century art, and at least in the United States. And yeah, so Davida, this came up when I reached out to you to see about participating in this panel. So I'd like to start with you to get your take on how being an artist has impacted your practice as a gallerist. And do you feel that you're in a position to better support your artists, being an artist yourself?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, when thinking about these questions, one of the things that came up was like being an artist means that you really believe in art and you believe in the work that you're putting forward, and you believe in the market value of the work as well. And I feel like that helps sell the work. And then in addition, like being an artist certainly helps guide an artist in the studio. And now I'm actually 10 years gallerist, so I have the experience of both gallerist and artist, and bringing that combination into an artist studio I feel like is actually the most helpful. I certainly think when you're running a gallery, having gallery experience helps you guide an artist in like how to properly prepare for an exhibition, and also expectations of that exhibition. But ultimately, being an artist, I really believe in art, and I believe in my artist's work. And I think that that's the foundation to to selling the work and presenting it. And yeah, that's kind of, as I mentioned, I don't really have a consistent practice anymore, and I've sort of pivoted more in the direction of gallerist. But anyone who knows me knows that I'm an artist, and it's kind of hard to hide that part of me. But yeah, this kind of belief in art is really what you need.
Definitely. And on that point about the pivot, Michelle, I'd like to direct this next question at you, but your project space, your nonprofit, along with curatorial work, teaching, the 2014 Whitney Biennial, these seem like the sort of professional undertakings that might undermine any effort to have a viable studio practice. And when I say seems, I think I mean that this has historically been the perception, and is sort of a crude conclusion, but it's not easy to just do so much. So anyway, running multiple spaces, doing all the rest, you've managed to accomplish a great deal as an artist, major gallery representation, institutional induction. And, we talked about this briefly before this panel, but I would say that early in my professional career, I would say up until around 2014, 2015, I knew of you as a professional, or thought of you as a professional colleague predominantly. And now that seems to have shifted, where at least I view you more as an artist. So is it the case that you find yourself pivoting, or do both exist concurrently? Or how do you attribute this shift in perception?
Thank you for the question. And it's an interesting one. And it may be answered best with a strange cliche, or a familiar cliche of the arc of time, right? So what happens now over 2 decades of running a space, one sees the shifting landscape of culture value an alternative like the suburban or the poor farm in some cases, and then that kind of evolving into not maybe being so influential, where the art market is, deep into a kind of exchange of the market exchange, right? So over the course of 2 decades plus, I've seen the suburban, the idea of the alternative fall in and out of influence. And that goes hand in hand with, as an artist, being an artist, and how I develop over time too, and how I'm seen within, kind of public perception as well. So, it really, it evolves, it ebbs and flows over time. I don't think it's a terrible conflict often, that between, being a gallerist or presenting and supporting other artists' work and my own work. I've come to believe in the old adage that, all attention is good for everybody across the board. That is a truism that I will stand by. But it is interesting to use artist-run spaces as a kind of map, looking back in terms of, our different values over time, how they shift. So that's interesting. So to your question, Nichole, yeah, sometimes it aligns, and sometimes it's a perfect balance between, the influence of the spaces, and my own work, and sometimes it falls, differently, right? Different influences come into being, and that's not hard when you start seeing it happen again and again and again. So, the question about pivoting multiple times.
Pivoting multiple times and over an extended period. Right. So the artist gallerist is a nimble individual, it would seem. Moving to you, Eric, really, this conversation is called Gallery as Practice. So just thinking about the evolution of an artistic practice, and do you see your gallery, do you see Bodega as an extension of your artistic practice?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that in a way it is, because it's just a thing that I do. I like to think that the work that I make is also just kind of like an extension of the life that I lead. But I don't think about the gallery necessarily as being an art practice in, I guess, a really conceptual way at all. I might even say that my art practice and my gallery practice are both extensions of my life, in a way that's equal, different, obviously, but yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say that I would think of the gallery as a practice that is my art practice.
Right, and then maybe just borrow Michelle's truism that all attention is good attention. All right, well, returning to our artist gallerist patron saint, the inimitable Betty Parsons. She's someone who, to my mind, was a casualty of her time. And while she was undoubtedly a successful business woman and gallerist in the noblest sense, given her dedication to programmatic rigor over commercial interests, as an artist, she lived in the shadow, at least early on, shadow of these white male abex titans. So she used her gallery as a platform following the departure of these artists, of these men, so that she could show the kinds of artists who were otherwise underrepresented, artists like herself, women artists, but also queer artists, also like herself, and artists of color, and those included, huge names to us today: Helen Frankenthaler, Agnes Martin, Louise Nevelson, Thomas Sills, Jose Bernal, Kenzo Okada, Roberto Mata, which proves to me that her gallery really was an extension of practice. In no way was her output going to rely on a narrow, commercially driven view. It was broad, it was inspired, it anticipated the market, as great art and great artists do. So she lives artistically in the shadows, really a consequence of her gender, but is still really encouraged by her artists. Ad Reinhardt apparently said that he thought she was a much better artist than him and the majority of her own roster of artists. Which is kind of an amazing thing to think that he would have said. And there's this sense that Betty was pigeonholed, or that she demurred when promoting her own work, but that she did so with a purpose, and that purpose was so that she could promote her own stable of artists, which is partly why I feel duty bound today as a woman currently working at a gallery with a substantial female roster and staff to promote her as an artist, because that's what she did and wasn't necessarily for her artist and wasn't necessarily able to do for herself. So still, Betty managed to show quite often, about 80 shows under her belt while she was alive, certainly many more since. She was a prolific and fervent creator always. So this next question goes to you, Rachel. Do you believe that Betty was expected to steer clear of self-promotion because it may have presented as a sort of conflict? Maybe it wasn't an option because of her gender. Do you agree that there's a conflict here? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Sure, thank you, Nichole. I think that promoting herself in her own gallery never even was in the same realm for Betty. I think that she knew that if she did that, it would degrade the integrity of her gallery. And I also think that the gallery itself was an expression of her own artistic creation. She said, actually, in talks with Ad Reinhardt, that there's enough of me on the walls, there's enough of me here anyway, I don't need my paintings on the walls. So she very vigilantly separated her own artistic practice from her gallery. I'm sure that the other gallerists, artists here can attest to the fact that there probably is an expectation of that. But at the time that Betty was working and practicing, she kept them completely separate. I think because she viewed the gallery as her best known work of art, and she herself became famous for works of art towards the end of her life. When she was in her 70s, she started creating these painted wooden sculptures from driftwood that she would find while walking on the beach in Long Island near her studio. And she would assemble them and paint them, and she received a lot of recognition for them. But again, these were sculptures that were not in the same realm or the same, medium as the artists that she was showing. So again, I think it was a further distinction that she was making, where she felt comfortable promoting her painted sculptures, and yet in her studio, in her apartment, there were hundreds of paintings of her own making. So I think she vigilantly separated them, but didn't feel underrepresented because the gallery itself was an expression of her own artistic creation.
Thank you. And to the other panelists, do you feel that self-promotion would somehow degrade the integrity of the professional work you do, or that there's plenty of you on the walls already, or do you find yourself met with any kind of contention from clients or your artists or anything like that?
I'll just mention a few experiences I had early on where we tried to, I had a partner for the first 5 years of the gallery, or like after I opened the gallery, Mika Marple was my partner, and we tried to put my work on the wall, and it was such an utter failure to try and sell your work, like it's kind of, even though you're kind of desperately trying to sell someone else's work while not trying to seem desperate, it just can't work with your own work. That was my experience. And from that experience, I would say that like, it's really hard to do that. And that's actually why gallerists exist. Gallerists exist as like an intermedium between collectors and the artists, and like also exist in the sensitive and crude transactions and the conversations that exist between collectors and gallerists, the ones that where people talk about an artist's work and kind of break it down to take it outside of maybe the artist's intention and bring it into a more crass commercial conversation. And I think it's interesting to hear about like Betty Parsons not necessarily having the same success as many of her artists in her gallery during her lifetime. But to me, like the issue is really like how commercial success is like the only measure of whether or not an artist is successful. And that, you know, I can't sway that perspective, but I definitely don't believe that. And it's just interesting that that's the only way we measure an artist's success, is whether or not they're commercially successful in their lifetime. And Betty Parsons should be an example of somebody who like was an incredible artist, and I can, from seeing her work, and I mean, one of the greatest painters I've ever seen. And maybe she didn't have the success during her lifetime, but that obviously is changing. But to answer your question, I think it's fairly challenging to sell your own art. I don't think it's impossible, but I couldn't do it. I also don't really want to sell my art. It's not for sale.
Yeah, I agree with
not for sale.
I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I think managing expectations for artists is the most difficult thing, right? So if one starts to, my experience, you know, I just decided to steer clear of integrating my own work into the identity of the Suburban or the Floor Farm, not because I don't think it's an interesting critical framework. I do that in other places, but because I'm already working with artists who have expectations, you know, that are exactly what Davida is saying. You know, we always default to these very traditional markers of what success looks like, even in alternative spaces. And, you know, I guess that shouldn't surprise me, kind of always does. So to, you know, to remind artists, I feel like I'm such a Debbie Downer all the time, talking to artists about, you know, thinking differently about what those criteria can be. That success doesn't come in real time, right? It doesn't come, you know, during the, you know, 8-week exhibition you have at the Night Gallery. Like, it may come at a different time, and to remind artists of that. Or again, those traditional measures, you know, of Instagram likes or sales or, I don't know, curatorial visits to the exhibition. Like, those things, you know, are great and fine, but that is, again, you know, it has to be in combination with other measures of how we, you know, deem what we are doing is valuable. So I think, you know, my choice has always been to kind of pull back from really, you know, the more obvious insertion of my own work into the project. Though it may have happened over the 20+ years in some capacity at an artist's request, not my request. I would never do that unless an artist was interested in that kind of conceptual play of breaking down authority. I'm always game for that, but I would never suggest that on my own.
I would also add that I don't necessarily think an artist is always the best person to explain their own work. I think that's why we depend on other people to help contextualize it. And I always think just when I'm in the gallery explaining an artist's practice to somebody, introducing it for the first time or just kind of elaborating on it, that in itself is so complicated, and like explaining a particular work is so complicated and there's so much nuance in it that it's, I think, a lot easier to not even like introduce one's own like practice or production of any sort.
Thank you for sharing all those thoughts.
I'm also interested in the idea of just measuring success, because during her lifetime, Betty had almost 90 shows of her own work, and she had 46 solo exhibitions and participated in 41 group exhibitions. And so it's interesting as an artist, I guess, just the metric by which we measure success, to me, that seems incredibly prolific. And yet it was only in her late 70s, mid to late 70s, did she receive recognition as being an artist in her own right.
Well, I would also say, I mean, one measure of success that's not included in those metrics is her political involvement. I mean, that's huge, especially given her time, just so incredible. But I have this Joan Semmel painting behind me, and just thinking about measures of success. I mean, another woman artist who's been working for, you know, about 5 decades now, who's very clearly, I mean, if you just look at the painting itself, you can see all of the artists who've been inspired by her style alone. So while there's not like insane household name measure of success, it's the sort of thing that I see there are other markers. I see the influence she's had, and that is one very serious marker of success. And there are these other ways of measuring it, but maybe not traditionally, which is a point you guys are all making. So I wanted to touch on a little bit more of the legacy of the artist gallerist, and just explore that a little bit more. Specifically, the legacy of the artist gallerists, so another set of trailblazers. Pat Hearn and her eponymous gallery, and then Colin DeLand and his gallery, American Fine Arts. Both of these spaces came on the heels of the 10th Street Gallery. So we seem to move from 57th Street to 10th Street in the East Village, then to Soho. Nowadays, we're in Chelsea for the most part, Lower East Side too. Tribeca now as well. But these two, I feel, really paved the way for the artist run space in the 21st century. Really how things are done now, sort of how they sort of set that stage. And a lot of the artist run spaces today occupy a kind of interstitial space, as Betty did, but a rare example in her time of both rigorous and experimental. And I think, again, this is in great part due to Hearn and DeLand. So thinking of mainstays like Mitchell Algus, who actually showed at Pat Hearn's gallery, to staples like Canada, 47 Canal, Ramekin Crucible, and certainly the spaces that are run by each of the panelists here. So, and of course there are many others, really too many to name. And then Hearn and DeLand to this day are consistently recognized for the communities of artists that they cultivated and fostered. And then they were active participants and enthusiastic ones, and collaborated with their artists all the time. So I really wanted to, with having said all of this, speak a little bit more about community and really the reality that as an artist, you bring a community with you to these spaces. It's something that's really singular and in stark contrast to the non-artist run spaces in large part. So to everyone, I guess we'll start with Michelle. How has your community of artists as an artist informed your professional work?
Yeah. So I would say that on an annual basis, you know, as a new batch of MFAs coming to the School of the Art Institute, you know, something changes. The audience changes. The conversation and discourse around art changes. Their embrace or push against what the alternative is in relationship to something that is constructed much more professionally changes. Yeah, I want to make a note right now, and maybe everybody can kind of circle back to the Hyde Park Art Center. Right now, there's an exhibition called Chicago 2.0 that actually looks at artist-run spaces in Chicago over the last decade. There was a 2.1 that the Suburban participated in 10 years ago. So kind of looking at that, you know, I want to say one thing, Nichole, you know, especially with Pat Hearn and Colin DeLand, you know, I think it's very special that one, and you know, of course, going back to Betty, very special to be able to think about ideas and make them primary over a center that is commercially driven. That is extraordinary, right? So being in Milwaukee or being in Chicago that doesn't have this commercial framework that everybody has to go through first, Chicago going back to, the 70s was always a not-for-profit artist-run space. That makes sense in relationship to, the commercial galleries that exist in that place. So, a kind of context also has a relationship to exactly the question that you're asking about our relationship to audience or our relationship to these other ideas.
Yeah, audience and ideas, those are also great points to touch on. So with the rest of the panelists, I don't know, Davida, if you wanted to go next, if you had any thoughts.
Well, yeah, Night Gallery certainly is a community. It's been called a cult by my own staff. No, I mean, I graduated from Columbia in 2009 and moved out to Los Angeles and basically started the gallery with the intention of showing my classmates. And that is how the gallery started and how it's continued. And through being in Los Angeles and connecting with artists here and connecting with artists in New York and Canada, which is where I'm from, and finding, kind of growing that community and being a platform of support. I mean, I think we support artists, the ones in Los Angeles, the best. But we certainly try to support our artists that are not here. And yeah, I would say that there's a really genuine sense of community here at the gallery. And we kind of take a different approach, like some galleries are very exclusive and like the whole idea is about exclusivity and their business model is about making people the inaccessibility. And, part of me trying to run a commercial gallery space is wondering if you can run a successful commercial gallery space while not doing that, while having a more inclusive space and a more nurturing space. And, I am very much like the matriarch of this gallery. And I just like having that be more of our business model. And it has worked so far, and it's something that I really find that to be like a distinction amongst Night Gallery, not against other galleries, but more just like a way of just defining ourselves. And all of that comes back to our community of artists.
Either Eric or Rachel, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well. I know that Bodega has an amazing community. I know less about Betty's community, but maybe Eric, if you want to start.
Yeah, I mean, something that I would add to kind of what Davida is saying is that art doesn't exist by just being on the wall. It is created by, and it kind of lives in social relationships. It exists to the extent that it is being activated by what people are saying about it, how people are relating to the world differently by virtue of seeing the work and experiencing the work. And so I would say that, artist-run spaces a lot of times are the places where community really coalesces in the art world. And that's certainly true for our space. That's certainly true for the artists that we work with. And I think that that's really kind of like where art is alive. And sometimes when you just kind of pay attention to things moving from one place to another, art as just an object, the work had a life, but it is no longer kind of like being formed, if that makes sense. And so I think that that's what's really exciting to me about running a space, operating the space with a community of peers that are the artists that we work with, through the perspective of being an artist, is that it really does feel like it's alive, you know?
To that point, Eric, actually, I think that that's probably one of the reasons why Betty felt that her gallery was an expression of her own artistic creation, because the network that surrounded her, she maintained fierce, loyal friendships with the majority of her artists, some of whom left her after she gave them their first shows, their first platforms. The most notorious were, as she actually deemed them, the Four Horsemen: Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, Barnett Newman, Clifford Still, these major abstract expressionists, all of whom left Betty after she gave them their platform, but all of whom she kept in touch with, except for, in her own words, she didn't keep in touch with Clifford Still. I don't know why, but the relationships that she cultivated and grew over the course of her decades-long career, I think is what both defined her gallery, defined the ethos of the gallery, and also attracted artists to her gallery. There's actually a really a famous quote by Cleve Gray, who said that he had so many dealers, but all these dealers didn't understand his art like Betty did. She had this artistic eye, and I think he stayed with her for decades, actually, and he had been waiting to get into her gallery since it opened. I don't know why he wasn't able to beforehand, but when he finally did, he stayed. But the community that she inspired was the community that also defined her gallery, and vice versa. I think it was a very symbiotic, natural progression. Once these sort of main stage abstract expressionists, straight white males, moved on to other more commercially successful enterprises, that actually freed up Betty to further express herself. She represented African-American artists, women, queer women, gay men, people who weren't in the mainstream at the time that she was operating. So while she didn't show her own artworks, I think the community itself was an extension of her and her ethos.
Can I add on to that just an additional point, and that's something we're building on now, and that is community, and community being social, right? Whether that's a kind of hyper locality, right, in a location, let's say, or a network of people that we come to know. I think with Parsons, what strikes me, and I know she had an important relationship with the individuals and a social structure within the gallery, but also how she thought about the language of abstraction, right? So early on, thinking about abstraction and thinking about how that represented, you know, the crisis, the energies of the world at that time, right? So there is something else besides the social, which I'm trying to think about what the equivalent could be, right? Social community, but also these other kinds of discourses that reached beyond, you know, the immediacy of individuals. That was huge and really important. And, you know, I hope that over the years, you know, it's a different time, right? We don't think about abstraction the same way. You know, the context of the world is very different. But, you know, hopefully that is something too that, you know, the suburban or the poor farm will be able to, in aggregate over time, you know, capture.
Yeah. Thank you, Michelle. I think there's a lot, this word community, it means a lot. And thinking about being idea driven, being community driven. And as you touched on earlier in this talk, Michelle, just the changing value systems. I feel it was probably heightened for Betty that, I mean, there is really such an urgency to her brand of abstraction. And just thinking about this, this art world that we're in and these changing value systems, really we're in an art world where we're sort of being subsumed by these monolithic, maybe more sterile mega galleries, where the monopoly feels very real right now. And that's part of the reason why I feel this conversation is so valuable, to really spotlight these you as individuals, but your spaces, your practices, the ideas that inform them. These aren't just puppy mills that are feeding commercial interests. These are something else altogether. You know, with the monopoly gallery, let's just say there really is no community. There's PR, there's brand strategy or brand identity. Just again, like no personality, maybe no integrity, certainly equity, anticipation, experimentation. These are market responsive or even market distorting enterprises, which to me is in stark contrast to the artist run space. And I always think about, and Michelle, thank you for bringing this up, but the audience, and really, if the audience is able to, and I believe that they are, but able to make the distinction between the work that we all do versus the work that's being done by the mega gallery. Not that they're all inherently like these terrible places, but there's just such a contrast in terms of the ideas that exist and like just the way they're operated. So to me, looking at history, it would seem as ever, you know, the artists will continue to find themselves dissatisfied with this sort of sterile, conservative, maybe zombie gallery, market-driven gallery, and that the artist-run gallery will be sort of, you know, an essential defender of autonomy and experimentation and community, also essential in allowing the audience to see and think critically and make the distinction. Davida, I feel like
I
you're
just
ready
want to add, well, I think like what's really important as a, I don't know if it's a distinction, but like when you run a gallery, your business is your life and your life is your business. And so it's about what kind of life you want to live. And like, do you want to live a life of art and love and community, or do you want to live a life where you're like chasing the dragon? And I mean, I certainly like, everybody who knows me knows I work 24/7, but I want to also live my life and live it as good as possible and as genuine as possible and as honest as possible and as successful as possible, like while managing all those expectations. And, you know, like every gallery is kind of a reflection of the person who's running it. And yeah, so I just feel like we have to decide we each have to decide what kind of life we want to live. And if you're going to be driven, can you manage like being driven by commercial success and art and even other sort of social achievements? Like for me, like, you know, being a mother is like super important and has kind of changed.
we've made it this far without technical difficulties, which is amazing. So no worries.
But yeah, that's all I'm saying is like, we have to live our lives and live it in the art world, living it in the art world, and outside of the art world too, right? There's a world outside of the art world. I've heard.
Is there? No. Yeah, exactly. Impressions from anyone else?
I can,
Rachel, yeah, I would love to hear from you.
Absolutely. I think when it comes to expectations, Betty shunned a lot of them and always did. When she was 13, she went to the 1913 Armory Show and snuck away by herself. And it was the show that scandalized American audiences, but it was a show that was the determinant factor in her decision to become an artist. She wanted to go to art school, but instead her parents sent her to finishing school. She agreed on the condition that she could take art lessons while she was in finishing school. So she was a product of her generation in certain ways. In terms of being able to live in the art world, she absolutely came from privilege. She was born into a society family. She was in page 6 of these tabloids of how she was gallivanting around on Mrs. Vanderbilt's yacht in the 20s, but she turned away from all of that. And she actually used that privilege and that access to give others a platform. And I think the idea of her community and her expectations actually do merge, because she was an openly gay woman, not very private about her relationships and her personal life, but identifying with her artists and identifying with their take on this art world. She would give, the gallery assistants with whom I've spoken have said that, I mean, they were in their 20s, they were in their 30s, and they would, and Betty would have dinner with them, she took them under her wing. So while she did have this privilege and she had this access that allowed her to have a certain kind of life, she didn't keep it to herself. She very much bestowed her gift, her wisdom, and I think her eye on the art world. And Michelle, to your point about the immediacy of abstraction, that is what Betty presented. And that's actually exactly what Betty's aesthetic was. I think it has to do with the fact that she didn't have much time in running a successful gallery. There wasn't much time in the day to paint. I mentioned that there's photos of her ripping canvas off of a roll or cutting it off of a roll, and then later photographs of that same cut canvas just tacked up on her studio wall. She would use frames and stretcher bars from the gallery. So whenever she could, with whatever she could get her hands on, she herself was making art. Every time she traveled with a notebook. She would paint, sketch furiously. And her niece actually said that when the family would take a vacation, everyone else would have a camera and Betty would have a sketchbook. So there was always this immediacy, and it's interesting how she translated that into the artists that she promoted and the work that she showed, that immediacy of abstraction.
And I want to say too, I think the thing that I most identify with her, giving big shifts in the cultural landscape, and that is something psychological, and that is Rachel, what you're talking about, and that is, I believe she recognized very clearly that she could evolve an imagination, a relationship to material art making, a visual language, right? Her practice, her art making, behind that which was in front of her, right? And there was great freedom behind it. It wasn't a place of, being, less than, right? That there was freedom there for her to have these conversations around ideas of abstraction, materiality, scale, right? And how, again, they interwove into the world we were living at a time, a national identity, and that she was able to have these conversations, and they actually fed her own thinking, her own work, without having what everybody else is saying, without having to put it forward in, the in-time professional art world, that is transactional, right? That she was able to nurture that. And I think that is that is amazing to find those spaces. You know, so often we think about, you know, these marginalized places of being a problematic relationship to power, but I believe she found freedom in there. And you know, I keep looking to her for that, because that is, for me, the most kind of fecund place to be, in front of family, in front of teaching, in front of galleries, that there's this other space that opens up. And as a human being, you know, we're all compelled to ideas that expand what we do in the studio. We can have those conversations in these other nodes that we intersect with.
Mhm. It's a symbiotic relationship, it sounds like. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Betty was incredible. Eric, would you like to add anything? I mean, happy to, we have a little bit more time, but there's a couple questions we might get to quickly in the chat, but I'd love to hear any last thoughts from you, Eric, followed by any other thoughts anyone else would like to share.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the community, you know, community is like the most important aspect of what the space that I run is, and a lot of the galleries that I think of as being the most influential historically are galleries that have kind of like they are the hubs for an artist's scene. And sometimes that's written into history, sometimes that's not written into history. Sometimes a gallery doesn't exist for long enough for a history to kind of like form around it. But if I can just kind of think, like, not necessarily in like a generation, like a human generation, but like a artistic generation, some of the galleries that were really influential to us before we started and moved to New York was just Real Fine Arts. They were probably like, you know, just 5 years ahead of us. 47 Canal, Rena Spallings, but all of those galleries that have these incredible legacies, I mean, incredible legacies in New York for sure, but also elsewhere. They're all artist-run spaces. And I think that the strength of all of those spaces is because the artists that are attending the openings, the social circle that they create is one in which the artists that are the peers are all judging the kind of like quality of the work together. And I might be biased because I am an artist, but I do typically think that artists are the best critics. I think that because they have kind of like they understand the process of making, they understand the necessity of like the openness of a work, that a work is not necessarily just what somebody says about it when they're trying to, you know, make it concise for a 5-minute or, you know, 10-second explanation. Yeah, I think that artists are typically the best critics, and in an artist-run space in those communities, that's where those ideas get tested and those ideas get really developed.
That's a great point. I mean, just thinking about our community of critics, are very well-known critics, I guess we can say, even like who the whole world in and outside the art world might recognize as an art critic. I mean, Peter Sheldall, not necessarily a maker, but a poet. So I definitely think, you know, he's very adjacent. Roberta Smith, who's not an artist herself, married to one, her husband is also a critic, but let's just say I prefer Roberta. So it's a really strong point too. I mean, Real Fine Arts wasn't referenced earlier in my litany, only because they've closed, but they had a huge impact on, I mean, anyone who lived in New York City was like going under the bridge in Brooklyn to see their shows, and it was a really incredible time and place to be. And Rena Spallings also just an amazing space for shows. And just looking at you know, who the spaces, the galleries that history has baptized, whether it's Pat Hearn or American Fine Arts or Betty Parsons Gallery, it seems that the standouts are definitely those spaces that have those communities. So that says a lot. And with that, is there anything else we want to talk about?
Well, I just want to say for the record, I know that Betty's gallery wasn't what sort of, it's sort of anachronistic to say it's an artist-run gallery, but I do believe it was. I mean, she learned the ropes. She has described herself as not being, quote, the best businesswoman, but she learned a lot. And I think that her commitment was always to her artists. And looking back, when we, I guess, figure out the parameters for defining an artist-run space, if it's putting the artist first and artist as critic, just, you know, fostering the community. I feel like it's obviously a you know, a 20th century label, but I'll say maybe late 20th century, 21st century label, an artist run space, but I do believe that Betty's gallery was absolutely that. And Eric, to your point about artists being the best critics, there are stories that I've read, articles, interviews with artists that she represented who said that they knew that she would like a work when she was incredibly excited. Her whole energy changed, and that was very invigorating for everyone. But if she didn't like something, she would just not say anything, and that silence was, quote, deafening. So I think it's it just, again, she just attracted people who subscribe to that vision. And there was also, again, I mentioned Cleve Gray before, but I'll mention him again because he said that her artists actively made the choice. Was it commercial? Was it for commercial success, or was it for artistic success or other successes that we're using different metrics to measure? He said you made your choice when you went to the Betty Parsons Gallery. So I think that can be said with all artist run space, that they make their choice and live by it.
I just have to say that I disagree. I don't think artists are the best critics. And the reason is because whenever an artist tells me they like something, it looks like their artwork. And I think they can't get out of their own head, and they can't, or that happens so often that I think there's like other people who can also be good art critics. Not exclusively artists, that's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
Very funny when artists tell me
I
what
think
they like.
other people can be good art critics. I would say that what I would say, just to maybe, I would agree with you that a lot of times an individual artist might not be the best critic, but I'm kind of maybe thinking about like the consensus, like an artistic, like a consensus of artists all agreeing that particular artist is good or particular artwork is good. I think.
But isn't that what's so like, isn't it so amazing when like the consensus is wrong and like something else comes, you know, surprising or like against that? Like that to me is like so much more interesting than the consensus. The consensus.
Well, I would say that the consensus among artists usually does run counter to larger consensus about what work is good or bad. But I don't know, that's maybe too broad a generalization to make, but.
I gotta like, yeah, I don't know. We could talk, but like this is a good conversation I'd like to have not broadcasted.
Make a comment on how Rachel left the framework of Betty Parsons, where artists had a choice, whether it was artistic success or commercial success, that they were able to kind of dive into, have that relationship. And I think maybe this is the teacherly part of me, that, you know, power for the artist can only come from, you know, much more than even triangulation of the multiple offerings of how one moves through and navigates the art world, the landscape, that cultural landscape that we're in. You know, critical success doesn't mean commercial success. Commercial success doesn't mean artistic success. And, you know, I always feel very disappointed with artists when they go right to that powerhouse, Nichole, that you're talking about. I find that to be so limiting. You know, some people may find freedom in that, right? You know, and the freedom they need comes from a kind of financial stability. I can recognize that, but I'm really confident that good work requires interesting thinking throughout the multiple power structures that kind of pulse through our art world and change on, you know, a near daily basis. You know, I'm not advocating that everybody, you know, map those things intimately. You know, over the years, and I think both Eric and Davida probably have experienced it too, you know, the critique that has been leveled on me is that, you know, oh, Michelle has, you know, is twirling multiple plates in the air as a means of success. And that success is what, you know, success with my own work, success for the gallery. And, you know, the fact is, it's just too much work. I love the work that I do, and I do it because I love that work. I love having that, you know, interplay with artists, learning about where power structures and culture are hidden and change and evolve. So I do it not out of some strategy for some kind of, you know, crazy Machiavellian way of cracking open some kind of nut. That's dreadful. Yeah, I just want to say that I just think that, you know, I'm really disappointed right now as we talk, as, you know, we are in a crisis, global crisis for all kinds of reasons, that, you know, artists double down on that which is, you know, so obvious. And that is, you know, the biggest monolithic bits of stability. If we don't take this instability and make something really interesting out of it, you know, that's heartbreaking, quite honestly.
Amen. Thank you. I know I've lightly, or maybe not so lightly, touched on that, but it is a real crisis. I mean, just as someone who's been in, we've all been in the art world for some time now, and it's not the art world, the way we're moving right now it's not where I want to see things go. I'm sure, yeah, Betty wouldn't be so pleased either. So, you know, it seems like there's always a call and response. There are moments of transition. We are in a crisis, but I'm really curious to see what comes out of it. I mean, one positive thing to come out of this horrible pandemic is that the commercial real estate is dropping the prices. So that means that you know, people can actually open spaces and have those platforms and start creative enterprises again. I mean, that's how it was back in the day in this city and in other cities. So hopefully we'll see more of that. I mean, the mega, the monoliths, they need the artist run space as incubator, right? They don't have artists without the artist run space, the mid-tier gallery. They wait for market acknowledgement, and they come and they gobble it up. So hopefully we won't continue to see a proliferation of that, but we continue ever onward and upward. And we're a bit over time now. I appreciate this. Looks like there's some questions in the chat feature, and apparently there's Q&A feature. I didn't know that, but thanks for submitting it there too. I don't think we really have time to get to anything, but I believe we have a lot of the emails if you registered. So Alexander Gray Associates will follow up to answer those questions, unless you guys have been looking at the chat feature and want to say anything quickly. But I think should probably just say a thank you to Frieze London for letting us host this conversation in conjunction with the run of the fair. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Davida. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Megan, down in your Betty Parsons icon box there. It's so great to see all of you. It's so great to engage in conversation and in dialogue like this in lieu of an exhausted art fair dinner. But I do look forward to one day being in a tent with all of you once again and having one of those really tired out dinners. Really looking forward to it.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you so much, Nichole.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.